The bus wheezed to a stop with a hydraulic sigh that seemed to echo longer than it should have in the mountain air. I gathered my worn leather satchel from the seat beside me, checking that my recorder and notebooks were still secure in the main compartment. 3 hours of winding roads had brought me here to Harksworth, a place that existed more as a rumor than a destination on most maps. I stepped down onto cracked asphalt, and the bus driver gave me a look that suggested I might be making a mistake. The doors closed behind me with finality, and I watched the vehicle disappear around a bend, leaving me alone at what could generously be called a bus stop. Really just a weathered signpost and a patch of gravel where the mountain road widened slightly. The silence hit me first. Not the peaceful quiet of a small town, but something heavier, more deliberate. I pulled out my phone to check the time, but the screen showed no signal bars. Not surprising this far into the mountains, but it made me feel more isolated than I'd expected. I turned toward the village proper and felt my breath catch slightly. Harksworth spread out below me like something from a postcard that had been touched up too many times. Every building looked freshly painted, every fence post perfectly straight, every garden meticulously maintained. The main street ran in a clean line through the center, flanked by shops and houses that seemed to gleam even in the overcast afternoon light. Something was off about the perfection. I'd covered plenty of small mountain communities over the years, and they all had character. Peeling paint here, a sagging porch there, weeds growing through sidewalk cracks, the kind of gentle decay that came with real people living real lives. Harksworth looked like a movie set dressed for filming. I started walking down the main road, my footsteps unnaturally loud on the pristine pavement. The Regional Herald had sent me here to investigate what should have been a simple human interest story. The Luckiest Citizen Award, supposedly given annually to one resident of Harksworth for outstanding community service. It sounded like the kind of heartwarming local tradition that made for easy copy during slow news weeks. But my preliminary phone calls had been strange. Every number I'd tried had been answered with the same careful politeness, the same vague responses, the same reluctance to provide details. People claimed not to know much about the selection process, couldn't remember past winners, suggested I speak to someone else who then gave me the same runaround. After 15 years of journalism, I'd developed a nose for when people were hiding something. Harksworth residents weren't just being unhelpful. They were being deliberately evasive. The inn appeared ahead of me, a 2-story building with a hand-painted sign that read, Harksworth Inn, Estuary, 1887, in letters that looked like they'd been touched up yesterday. Flower boxes beneath each window overflowed with blooms that shouldn't have been thriving this late in the season. Even the brass door handle gleamed like someone polished it daily. I pushed open the front door and stepped into a lobby that smelled of lemon oil and something else I couldn't identify. Something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn slightly. The interior matched the exterior's obsessive maintenance, hardwood floors that reflected the overhead lights, furniture that looked antique but showed no signs of actual wear, walls lined with photographs of village events that all seemed to feature the same forced smiles. A woman emerged from behind the front desk before I'd taken 3 steps into the lobby. She was around 55, with graying brown hair pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to stretch the skin around her eyes. Her dress was dark blue with a white apron that looked like it had never seen actual work. "You must be the reporter," she said, and her smile felt like something she'd practiced in a mirror. I stopped walking. "I'm sorry?" Frederick Armstrong from the Regional Herald. She moved around the desk with quick, efficient steps. "I'm Avery Day, the proprietor. We've been expecting you." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I'd made my travel arrangements under my own name, but I'd never contacted the inn directly. My editor had simply told me to find lodging in Harksworth and expense it. There was no reason this woman should know who I was or why I was here. "I haven't made a reservation," I said carefully. "Oh, that's quite all right. We have a room prepared for you." Avery's smile never wavered, but her eyes had gone sharp and watchful. "You're here about the ceremony, I assume?" I set my satchel down and pulled out my notebook, more to buy myself time to think than because I needed to take notes yet. The Luckiest Citizen Award, yes. I was hoping to speak with some residents about the tradition. The change in Avery's expression was subtle but unmistakable. The practiced smile faltered for just a moment, and her hands smoothed down her apron in a gesture that looked automatic and nervous. "It's just a private community celebration," she said, and her voice had gone flat. "Nothing that would interest outsiders, really. When I called last week, several people mentioned it was quite an honor. I'd love to learn more about how recipients are chosen, maybe speak with this year's winner." Avery's hands were working at her apron again, smoothing fabric that was already perfectly pressed. I really couldn't say much about the process. Very traditional, you understand? Been the same way for generations. She was lying. Not about the tradition being old, I could believe that, but about not knowing the details. Everything about her body language screamed that she knew exactly how the selection worked and desperately didn't want to talk about it. "Could you point me towards someone who might know more? A town council member, perhaps, or whoever organizes the ceremony?" "I'm afraid I have to see to the kitchen now," Avery said, already backing toward a door behind the front desk. "Your room is number 7, top of the stairs. Keys on the desk there." She disappeared through the door before I could ask another question, leaving me alone in the too-perfect lobby with the distinct feeling that I'd just confirmed something she'd been afraid of. I picked up the old-fashioned brass key marked with a 7 and climbed stairs that didn't creak under my weight. Room 7 was as meticulously maintained as everything else I'd seen. A bed with hospital corners, a writing desk that looked unused, curtains that hung in perfect folds. I dropped my satchel on the bed and looked out the window at the village center below. From this height, Harksworth's artificial perfection was even more obvious. The geometric precision of the gardens, the way every building seemed to have been painted in the same month, the complete absence of anything that looked lived in or comfortable. It was like someone had built a museum exhibit of what a mountain village should look like. I grabbed my notebook and headed back downstairs. Avery was nowhere to be seen, which suited me fine. I wanted to talk to residents before word spread that the reporter had arrived, though apparently that ship had already sailed. The main street stretched out before me like a stage set waiting for actors. A few people moved between the shops, but they walked with purpose, heads down, no lingering or casual conversation. I approached a middle-aged man coming out of what looked like a general store. "Excuse me," I said, pulling out my press credentials. "I'm Frederick Armstrong with the Regional Herald. I'm here doing a story about your Luckiest Citizen Award." The man looked at my credentials, then at my face, and I watched the same careful mask slide into place that I'd seen on Avery Day. "Jimmy Bailey," he said, extending a hand that was damp with nervous sweat. "I run the shop here." "Great to meet you, Jimmy. Can you tell me how long the award has been part of your community?" Jimmy's eyes darted toward the shop behind him, then back to me. "Oh, I wouldn't know much about that. Been here my whole life, but I don't really pay attention to the official things." Another lie. I could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, the way he couldn't quite meet my eyes. This was a man who knew exactly what I was asking about and wished I'd never shown up to ask. Who would be the best person to speak with about the selection process? I really couldn't say. Jimmy was already stepping backward, putting distance between us. "Maybe ask around, see what you can find out." He turned and hurried back into his shop, leaving me standing on the sidewalk with the growing certainty that I'd stumbled onto something much more interesting than a simple community award. I tried 3 more residents over the next hour, and each conversation followed the same pattern. Initial politeness, careful responses that revealed nothing, and quick exits as soon as they could manage them. A woman named Irene Willis, who'd been tending a garden that looked like something from a magazine, insisted the award was just harmless tradition. before suddenly remembering urgent business inside her house. By the time I made it back to the inn, the sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows that made Harksworth's perfection look even more unsettling. I sat at the small desk in my room and spread out my notes, trying to make sense of what I'd learned. Every person I'd spoken with had known who I was before I introduced myself. Every one of them had been prepared for my questions about the award, and every single one had given me responses that were clearly rehearsed to reveal nothing while appearing cooperative. I stared out the window at the village center, now empty except for the warm glow spilling from shop windows. Somewhere down there, people were going about their evening routines, probably talking about the reporter who'd come asking uncomfortable questions. The reporter they'd all somehow known was coming, despite my unannounced arrival. I opened my laptop and tried to connect to the internet, but there was no Wi-Fi signal available. The inn's information packet mentioned wireless access, but my computer found nothing. Another small detail that felt deliberate rather than accidental. I flipped through my notes again, looking for patterns, connections, anything that might explain the coordinated evasiveness I'd encountered. One thing was clear. Whatever the Luckiest Citizen Award really was, it wasn't the simple community tradition everyone wanted me to believe. And whatever was happening in Harksworth, the residents were very, very afraid of anyone finding out about it. The realization settled over me like a weight. I'd come here expecting to write a fluff piece about small-town values and community spirit. Instead, I'd walked into something that had the entire population scared enough to lie to a reporter's face. I closed my notebook and looked out at the unnaturally quiet street below. Tomorrow I'd have to dig deeper, push harder, find someone willing to tell me what was really going on. But tonight, sitting in this too-perfect room in this too-perfect village, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was the one being watched. I needed coffee before tackling another round of interviews, but the inn's dining room had been empty when I checked downstairs. No sign of Avery either, which struck me as odd for what was supposedly a functioning establishment. The whole place felt more like a museum exhibit than a working inn. My notebook from yesterday sat open on the small desk by the window, filled with notes that painted a clear picture of coordinated evasion. Every resident I'd spoken to had known exactly who I was and why I was there. Yet none could provide even basic details about their so-called community tradition. That kind of synchronized ignorance didn't happen by accident. I grabbed my satchel and headed out into the morning air. The village looked even more unnaturally perfect in daylight, if that was possible. Every blade of grass seemed trimmed to identical height. Every flower bloomed in precise geometric patterns. It was the kind of place that would photograph beautifully for a tourism brochure, but walking through it felt like being inside a diorama. The Regional Herald had sent me here to write about the Luckiest Citizen Award based on a press release they'd received. Simple human interest story, they'd said. Feel-good piece about small-town values and community recognition. But after yesterday's interviews, I was starting to think the real story was why everyone was so determined to keep me from learning anything about it. I pulled out the crumpled press release from my jacket pocket and reread it while walking. Jasmine Ortiz, 32, selected as this year's recipient for her outstanding contributions to community welfare. The ceremony was scheduled for tomorrow evening at the village center. Standard boilerplate language, nothing that would normally raise red flags. But whoever had written it had been careful to include just enough details to sound legitimate while revealing absolutely nothing substantive. My plan was to find Jasmine Ortiz herself. If she was the current award recipient, she'd have to know more than the evasive non-answers I'd gotten from everyone else yesterday. The press release had mentioned she worked at the local bank, but I figured trying her home first might catch her in a more relaxed setting. Maple Street turned out to be on the village's east side, where the houses were noticeably larger and better maintained than the already pristine buildings closer to the center. I checked house numbers until I found the right address, then stopped short when I saw the place. The Ortiz house was impressive in a way that didn't match what I'd expected from a small mountain village. 2 stories of recent construction with a wraparound porch and professional landscaping that looked like it belonged in an upscale suburban development. The driveway held a new sedan and a late-model pickup truck, both spotless and expensive. For a bank employee in a town this size, Jasmine Ortiz was doing remarkably well for herself. I walked up the flagstone path and knocked on the front door. Through the glass panels on either side, I could see into a spacious entryway with hardwood floors and what looked like genuine antique furniture. This wasn't just comfortable living, this was serious money. The woman who answered the door matched the photo from the press release, though she looked younger in person. Blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail, bright blue eyes, wearing casual clothes that still managed to look expensive. She smiled when she saw me, but there was something guarded about her expression. "You must be the reporter," she said. "Frederick Armstrong, right? From the Regional Herald?" There it was again. I hadn't called ahead, hadn't made an appointment, but somehow she knew exactly who I was and why I was there. Just like everyone else in this place. "That's right," I said. "I was hoping we could talk about the award ceremony tomorrow. Congratulations, by the way." Her smile brightened, though it still didn't quite reach her eyes. "Thank you, please, come in. I was just making tea." She led me through the entryway into a living room that confirmed my impression about their financial situation. The furniture was all high-end pieces, arranged with the kind of casual precision that suggested either professional decorating or someone with naturally excellent taste. Family photographs covered the mantelpiece and side tables, showing Jasmine with a dark-haired man I assumed was her husband and a young girl with blonde curls who had to be their daughter. "Beautiful home," I said, settling into an armchair that probably cost more than my monthly rent. "You've done well for yourself." "We've been very fortunate," she said, disappearing into what I assumed was the kitchen. "The award has brought us so many blessings." I pulled out my notebook and looked around while she was gone. The photographs showed a progression over time, from what looked like a modest apartment to increasingly nice settings, culminating in shots taken in this house. The family looked happy in all of them, but there was something about the most recent photos that struck me as almost too perfect. The lighting was flawless, the poses natural, but somehow idealized, like they'd been taken by a professional photographer who specialized in creating images of domestic bliss. Jasmine returned with a tea service that matched the rest of the house's upscale aesthetic. Fine china, silver spoons, everything arranged on a tray that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. She poured carefully, her movements precise and practiced. "So, tell me about the award," I said, accepting the delicate cup she offered. "How long have you lived in Harksworth?" 3 years now," she said, settling into the chair across from me. "We moved here from the city after Kyle got offered a position with the Forestry Service. Best decision we ever made." I made notes while she talked, but I was watching her face more than writing. Unlike the other residents I'd interviewed, she seemed genuinely willing to discuss her situation. Maybe being the current recipient gave her more latitude to talk, or maybe she was just more confident than the others. "The award came as a complete surprise," she continued. "I mean, I'd heard about it, of course. Everyone in the village knows about the tradition, but I never imagined I'd be selected." "How does the selection process work?" I asked. "Who decides?" For just a moment, her smile faltered. She took a sip of tea, and I noticed her hand was less steady than it had been a moment before. "It's a community decision," she said. "The village council meets and discusses potential recipients. They look for people who've made meaningful contributions to local life." It was the same kind of vague non-answer I'd gotten from everyone else, but delivered with more polish. I pressed a little harder. "What kind of contributions did you make? Community service, volunteer work?" "Oh, the usual things," she said, waving a hand dismissively. helping with church events, organizing fundraisers, that sort of thing. Nothing too exciting. I wrote that down, though it still didn't explain much. And the award itself, what does it involve? Is there a monetary component, or is it purely ceremonial? That's when I saw the first real crack in her composure. Her teacup rattled slightly against the saucer as she set it down, and her eyes darted toward the large window that looked out toward the forest beyond the village's eastern edge. "It's more than money," she said quietly. "The award brings good fortune. Real, tangible improvements to your life. Things start going your way in ways you never expected." Now we were getting somewhere. I leaned forward slightly, keeping my voice conversational. "Can you give me some examples?" She looked at the family photographs on the mantelpiece, and her expression softened with what looked like genuine affection. "Everything changed after I was selected," she said. "Kyle had been passed over for promotion twice, but suddenly his supervisor recommended him for a regional manager position. The pay increase was substantial. Then we found this house, and the previous owners were motivated to sell quickly. So we got it for a fraction of what it should have cost." She gestured around the elegant living room. My own career took off too. I'd been a teller at the bank for 2 years, with no advancement prospects, but within months of receiving the award, I was promoted to assistant manager, then to branch manager. And Sadie... She paused, looking at a photo of the blonde girl. We'd been trying to have children for years with no success. The doctors said it was unlikely we'd ever conceive naturally, but 3 months after the ceremony, I was pregnant. Sadie was born perfect, healthy, beautiful, everything we'd dreamed of. I wrote quickly, trying to capture not just her words, but the way her voice had changed as she talked about these developments. There was genuine warmth there, real gratitude and love for her family. But underneath it, something else was building, a tension that hadn't been there when she'd first invited me in. "That's quite a string of good luck," I said. "All of this happened after you received the award?" "Within the first year," she confirmed. "It was like every door that had been closed suddenly opened, every obstacle disappeared. We went from struggling to make ends meet to living better than we'd ever imagined possible." The rational part of my mind was already working through the logical explanations. Coincidence, confirmation bias, the kind of positive thinking that could create self-fulfilling prophecies. But the journalist in me was more interested in the story she was telling and the way she was telling it, because despite the obvious happiness these changes had brought her, Jasmine Ortiz was getting more nervous by the minute. Her hands had developed a slight tremor that she was trying to hide by keeping them folded in her lap. Her glances toward the window were becoming more frequent, and each time she looked that direction, her expression tightened with what looked suspiciously like fear. "It sounds like the award has been wonderful for your family," I said carefully, "though I have to say you seem a bit anxious talking about it." She laughed, but it came out forced and brittle. "Anxious? No, not at all. Why would I be anxious?" "You keep looking toward the window," I pointed out, "and your hands are shaking." That's when everything changed. The polite, controlled facade she'd been maintaining cracked completely. Her teacup clattered against the saucer as she set it down with hands that were now visibly trembling. She stood up abruptly and walked to the window, peering out at the tree line with an expression that could only be described as haunted. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You need to leave Harksworth. Tonight." I stayed in my chair, but every instinct I'd developed in 15 years of journalism was suddenly alert. This was the moment when sources either opened up completely or shut down permanently. How I handled the next few minutes would determine whether I learned anything useful or found myself facing another wall of evasion. "Why should I leave?" I asked quietly. "What are you afraid of?" She turned from the window to face me, and I saw genuine terror in her eyes. Not discomfort, not nervousness, but the kind of deep, primal fear that people felt when they believed they were in real danger. "The ceremony is tomorrow night," she said. "You can't be here for the ceremony." "What happens at the ceremony?" "I can't tell you that." She wrapped her arms around herself, a defensive gesture that made her look smaller and younger. "Some stories aren't meant to be told." I set down my own teacup and pulled out my phone, checking the time. "There's an evening bus that stops at the village entrance, right? 7:30? She nodded eagerly. "Yes, you could catch it tonight. Go back to your newspaper, write that the award is just a nice community tradition, nothing newsworthy. Everyone would be happy with that story." "Including you?" The question seemed to hit her like a physical blow. She sank back into her chair, and for a moment I thought she might start crying. "It doesn't matter what would make me happy," she said. "What matters is that you pack your things and get on that bus." I leaned forward, keeping my voice gentle but persistent. "Jasmine, I can see that you're frightened. If something's wrong here, if you need help, I might be able to do something about it. But you have to tell me what's going on." She shook her head violently. "You don't understand. This isn't the kind of problem that gets solved by newspaper articles or outside intervention. This is bigger than that, older than that." "Older how?" Another glance toward the window, this one longer and more fearful than the others. Whatever she was looking for out there, she was terrified of seeing it. "The award isn't new," she said finally. "It's been happening for generations. Every year, someone is chosen. Every year, they receive good fortune beyond anything they could have imagined. And every year..." She trailed off, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. "Every year what?" I pressed. "You need to leave," she repeated, standing up again. "Please, pack your things and catch the evening bus. Don't ask any more questions. Don't try to attend the ceremony. Just go." I could see that I'd pushed as far as she was willing to go. The fear in her voice was real, and whatever was driving it ran deeper than simple reluctance to talk to a reporter. She was genuinely terrified, not just for herself, but apparently for me as well. "All right," I said, closing my notebook and standing up. "Thank you for the tea. And for talking with me." She walked me to the door, her movements quick and nervous. As I stepped onto the porch, she caught my arm. "Promise me you'll leave tonight," she said urgently. "Promise me you won't try to stay for the ceremony." I looked into her frightened blue eyes and saw a desperation that made my chest tight. Whatever was happening in Harksworth, Jasmine Ortiz believed it was dangerous enough to risk begging a complete stranger to flee. "I'll think about what you've said," I told her. It wasn't the promise she wanted, but it was all I was prepared to give. She released my arm and stepped back, already shaking her head. "That's not good enough," she whispered. "But I can't make you understand. I can only warn you." She closed the door between us with a soft but final click. I walked back down Maple Street with Jasmine's desperate warnings echoing in my head. Her terror had been real, the kind of fear that made someone grab a stranger's arm and beg them to flee. But instead of scaring me away, her reaction convinced me I was onto something significant. Whatever happened at these ceremonies, it was serious enough to transform a confident bank manager into someone who jumped at shadows. The afternoon stretched ahead of me with new purpose. I pulled out my notebook and flipped to a fresh page, writing "Previous Winners" at the top. If this award had been happening for generations, as Jasmine claimed, there should be other recipients in town. Finding them might give me the full picture she'd been too frightened to provide. I started with the most logical approach, returning to the village center and asking direct questions. The general store seemed like the best place to begin, since Jimmy Bailey had lived here his entire life, according to our brief conversation yesterday. The bell above the door chimed as I entered his shop. Bailey looked up from behind the counter where he was arranging candy bars with unnecessary precision. His face tightened when he saw me, but he managed a strained smile. "Back again, Mr. Armstrong. I'm hoping you can help me with something." I approached the counter, keeping my tone casual. I'm trying to get a broader perspective on the Luckiest Citizen Award. Could you point me towards some previous winners? I'd love to speak with them about their experiences. Bailey's hand stilled on the candy display. He didn't meet my eyes. Previous winners? From past years? This tradition has been going on for a while, right? Well, yes, but... He straightened up and wiped his palms on his apron. Most of them have moved away. You know how it is. People get restless, want to try new places. All of them moved away? The ones I can think of, yes. His voice had that same rehearsed quality I'd heard from everyone yesterday. Sorry I can't be more helpful. I tried a different angle. What about from when you were younger? Surely you remember some winners from your childhood. Bailey started rearranging the same candy bars again. Memory isn't what it used to be, and I should really get back to inventory. He turned away from me, making it clear the conversation was over. I bought a pack of gum I didn't want and left, adding his name to my growing list of evasive responses. The pattern repeated itself at every stop I made. Irene Willis claimed she'd only lived in Harksworth for 5 years and didn't know about previous awards. A man tending his garden said the winners had moved on to bigger things but couldn't provide names or details. An elderly woman walking her dog insisted she had poor memory for such things and hurried away before I could ask follow-up questions. By late afternoon, I had spoken with 8 different residents. Every single one claimed either ignorance or convenient memory loss about past award recipients. The coordinated nature of their responses was becoming impossible to ignore. You don't get this level of consistent evasion without preparation. I found myself back at the inn as the sun started its descent behind the mountains. Avery was behind the front desk, updating what looked like a guest ledger with meticulous handwriting. She glanced up when I entered, her expression guarded. "How was your day, Mr. Armstrong?" "Educational." I approached the desk, deciding to try direct pressure. "I've been looking for previous Luckiest Citizen winners to interview. Funny thing, everyone tells me they've all moved away, every single one." Avery's pen stopped moving. People do leave small towns. All of them. Not one stayed to enjoy their good fortune here in Harksworth. She set down her pen and looked at me directly for the first time since I'd arrived. Her blue eyes held a mixture of wariness and something that might have been resignation. "What exactly are you trying to find, Mr. Armstrong?" "The truth about what happens at these ceremonies." The silence stretched between us. Avery's fingers drummed once against the desk surface before she caught herself and stilled them. "Some truths are dangerous," she said finally. "Is that a warning or a threat?" "It's practical advice." She picked up her pen again but didn't resume writing. "There are older residents who might have better memories than most. Glenn Dominguez has lived here longer than anyone." The admission seemed to surprise her as much as it did me. She immediately looked like she regretted the words. "Where would I find Mr. Dominguez?" Avery hesitated, then sighed. "Pine Street, last house on the left, but I didn't send you there." "Understood." I headed upstairs to grab my recorder and check my notes before making this potentially crucial contact. If Glenn Dominguez was Harksworth's oldest resident, he might remember previous ceremonies and winners. More importantly, if Avery had reluctantly given me his name after persistent questioning, she might believe he was someone who could or would tell me the truth. Pine Street turned out to be a narrow road that curved away from the village center toward the tree line. The houses here were smaller and older than those on Maple Street, with the weathered look of buildings that had seen decades of mountain winters. I walked past modest cottages with small yards until I reached the last house on the left. Glenn Dominguez's home was a single-story structure with faded blue paint and a covered porch that sagged slightly at one corner. The yard was neat but not obsessively maintained like the rest of the village. Real grass grew here, with natural variations in height and color that made it look authentically lived in. I climbed the wooden steps and knocked on the front door. After a long moment, it opened to reveal a man who had to be in his late 70s. He was tall but stooped, with wispy white hair and deep-set gray eyes that studied me with sharp intelligence. His lined face showed the weathering of someone who'd spent years outdoors, and his clothes, worn sweater and comfortable slacks, suggested he valued practicality over appearance. "You'd be the reporter," he said without preamble. "Frederick Armstrong, Regional Herald. Are you Glenn Dominguez?" "I am." He continued studying me with those penetrating eyes. "Avery sent you my way, did she? She mentioned you might have better memories than most about Hawksworth's history." Glenn made a sound that might have been amusement. "That's one way to put it." He stepped back from the door. "Come in, then. If we're going to have this conversation, we might as well do it properly." I followed him into a living room that felt like stepping back in time. The furniture was old but well-maintained, with doilies on the armrests and antimacassars on the chair backs. The walls were covered with framed photographs spanning what looked like decades of Hawksworth life. Groups of people at various gatherings, seasonal celebrations, church events, a visual history of the community. "Sit," Glenn said, gesturing to an armchair while he settled into what was clearly his preferred spot by the window. "Can I offer you something to drink? Coffee, something stronger?" "Coffee would be great." "Actually," he said, reconsidering, "I think I'll have whiskey. This conversation calls for it. You can have coffee if you prefer, but I suspect you'll want something stronger before we're done." Something in his tone made me change my mind. "Whiskey sounds fine." Glenn moved to a small cabinet and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid from a bottle that looked like it had been around as long as he had. He handed me one and returned to his chair, taking a sip before speaking. "So you want to know about the Luckiest Citizen Award? Everyone else seems determined not to talk about it. Can't blame them for that." Glenn took another sip and studied me over the rim of his glass. "Question is whether you're someone who can handle the truth. Most people can't." "Try me." Glenn was quiet for a long moment, his gray eyes never leaving my face. I had the sense I was being evaluated, that he was weighing something important in his mind. "You've been asking about previous winners," he said finally. "Yes. I'm told they all moved away." "That's what people say." Glenn set down his glass and leaned back in his chair. "Been saying it for decades. Easier than explaining what really happened to them." My pulse quickened, but I kept my voice steady. "What really happened to them?" Glenn gestured toward the photographs on his walls. "Take a look at those pictures, Mr. Armstrong. Tell me what you notice." I stood and examined the framed images more carefully. They showed groups of villagers at various events, spanning what appeared to be several decades based on the clothing and photographic quality. As I studied them, a pattern began to emerge. "There are people in the older photos who don't appear in the newer ones," I said. "That's right, and not because they aged out or died natural deaths." Glenn's voice had taken on a gravelly quality. "They were chosen." I returned to my chair, the whiskey suddenly tasting sharper. "Chosen for what?" Glenn picked up his glass again and took a longer drink this time. When he spoke, his words came slowly, as if he was choosing each one carefully. Hawksworth wasn't always the prosperous little community you see today. Generations ago, this was a struggling farming village. Harsh winters, poor soil, failed crops year after year. People were leaving, businesses closing, we were dying as a community. He paused, looking out the window toward the tree line visible in the distance. Then the Luckbringer came. The what? That's what we called him. Still do, those of us old enough to remember the stories our grandparents told. Glenn's eyes returned to mine. Mysterious figure who appeared one winter when things were at their worst, made the village an offer. The room felt colder suddenly, though I knew it was just my imagination. What kind of offer? Prosperity in exchange for tribute, annual tribute. Glenn's weathered hands gripped his glass tighter. One person each year would go to live with him in the forest. In return, our harvests would flourish, our businesses would thrive, our families would prosper. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. You're talking about human sacrifice. Not sacrifice exactly. The chosen ones go willingly. That's part of the agreement. Glenn's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he was discussing crop rotation or weather patterns. They're honored, celebrated, given a year of good fortune before their time comes. The luckiest citizen award. Now you understand. Glenn finished his whiskey and set the empty glass on the table beside his chair. Every year, the village council selects someone. They receive a year of blessings, financial success, career advancement, personal fulfillment, everything they could want. And then they fulfill their obligation. They walk into the forest and join the luck-bringer, and the cycle continues. I felt like the floor had shifted beneath me. The perfect village, the coordinated evasion, Jasmine's terror. It all made horrible sense now. How long has this been going on? 70 years, give or take, since the agreement was made. Glenn studied my face, watching my reaction. Village has prospered ever since. You've seen it yourself. Successful businesses, beautiful homes, healthy families. The luck bringer keeps his part of the bargain. And people just accept this? People want to survive, want their children to have better lives. Glenn's voice carried the weight of decades. When you're faced with extinction or accommodation, most choose accommodation. I thought about Jasmine's desperate warnings, her insistence that I leave before tomorrow's ceremony. What happens if someone refuses? If the chosen person won't go? Glenn's expression darkened. That's not a question anyone wants answered. The agreement is sacred. It's not broken. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Jasmine Ortiz. She's this year's choice. Yes. And tomorrow night, she'll walk into the forest, and Harksworth will continue to prosper for another year. Glenn's hands tightened around his whiskey glass. The amber liquid caught what little light filtered through his dusty windows, and I watched him take another slow sip before continuing. Something in his posture had shifted, shoulders pulling inward, as if the weight of what he was about to tell me had suddenly become heavier. You have to understand, he said, voice dropping to barely above a whisper. This arrangement went on for years without anyone questioning it. The village prospered, people were content. But as time passed, some folks started feeling uncomfortable about the whole thing. I leaned forward in my chair, pen poised over my notebook. The whiskey burned in my throat, but I barely noticed. Glenn's revelation about the luck bringer had already turned everything I thought I knew about Harksworth upside down. Now it sounded like there was more to the story. By 1952, there was a group on the village council who'd had enough, Glenn continued. Younger folks, mostly. People who'd moved here after the war and didn't fully understand what they were asking for when they said we should break the pact. My pen scratched across the paper as I took notes, trying to capture every detail. The idea that the village had actually tried to end this supernatural arrangement was both encouraging and terrifying. If they'd succeeded, maybe there was hope for Jasmine. But something in Glenn's tone told me the story didn't have a happy ending. What happened when they tried to break it? I asked. Glenn set his glass down on the side table with deliberate care. His gray eyes met mine, and I saw decades of guilt and regret swimming in them. The consequences were immediate and devastating. He stood up slowly, his joints creaking with age, and walked to the wall of photographs. His finger traced along the frames until he found what he was looking for. A black and white picture of the village from what looked like the 1950s. Even in the faded photograph, I could see the difference. Buildings with broken windows, overgrown lots where houses should have been, streets that looked more like dirt paths than the pristine pavement I'd walked on today. The crops failed that first year, Glenn said, still studying the photograph. Complete failure. Nothing would grow, not even the hardiest vegetables. The soil turned sour overnight like something had poisoned it from the inside out. I wrote furiously, trying to keep up with his words while processing the implications. A supernatural entity powerful enough to control agricultural success across an entire region was beyond anything I'd expected to encounter in my career as a journalist. This wasn't just a local legend or harmless folklore. This was something with real, measurable power over people's lives. But that was just the beginning, Glenn continued, returning to his chair. Businesses started failing next. The general store couldn't keep inventory. Shipments would arrive spoiled or damaged, or they wouldn't arrive at all. The bank had a string of robberies that cleaned out most of the local accounts. People who'd lived here their whole lives suddenly found themselves without work, without savings, without hope. The whiskey was making my head feel fuzzy, but I forced myself to focus. This was the kind of information that could change everything, not just for my article, but potentially for Jasmine's fate tomorrow night. If the village had broken the pact once, maybe they could do it again. Maybe there was a way to save her. How long did this go on? I asked. 5 years, Glenn said quietly. 5 years of watching our community tear itself apart. But the worst part wasn't the economic collapse or the failed crops. It was the accidents. He paused, reaching for his whiskey again. His hands were shaking slightly, and I realized that even decades later these memories still haunted him. I waited, letting him gather himself, knowing that pushing too hard might cause him to shut down completely. They seemed random at first, he finally continued. A ladder collapsing when someone was fixing their roof, a car sliding off the mountain road on a clear, dry day, equipment malfunctioning at the worst possible moment. But they kept happening, week after week, month after month, and they were always fatal. My stomach clenched as I wrote down his words. The idea of supernatural retribution was one thing, but hearing about actual deaths, people dying because their community had tried to break free from this arrangement, made everything feel more real and more urgent. How many people died? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. 17, Glenn said without hesitation. 17 people in 5 years in a village that had maybe 200 residents total, and every single death could be explained away as an accident or coincidence. Nothing that would draw outside attention or investigation, just enough to make the message clear. I looked up from my notebook, studying Glenn's weathered face. He'd lived through this. He'd watched his neighbors and friends die because of a decision to break free from supernatural bondage. No wonder the current residents were so terrified of discussing the luckiest citizen award with an outsider. They knew exactly what could happen if the arrangement was threatened. So the village gave in, I said. It wasn't really a question. The surviving members of the council met in 1957, Glenn confirmed. By then, most of the people who'd pushed for breaking the pact were dead or had fled the village. The few of us left knew we had to make things right, or there wouldn't be a Harksworth left to save. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a yellowed piece of paper, unfolding it carefully. Even from across the room, I could see it was covered in handwritten text. The ink faded, but still legible. This is a copy of the resolution they passed, Glenn said, holding it up, reinstating the tribute, but with modifications. The council knew they couldn't go back to the old way, just selecting someone and sending them into the forest without any pretense. Too many people had moved here who didn't understand the history, so they created the Luckiest Citizen Award. The pieces were falling into place, but the picture they formed made me feel sick. The award wasn't just a disguise for human sacrifice. It was a carefully constructed system designed to maintain the illusion of normalcy while feeding people to a supernatural entity. The award serves multiple purposes: Glenn continued as if reading my thoughts. It identifies the chosen person to the community in a way that seems positive and celebratory. It gives the luck bringer a full year to prepare the recipient for their fate. And it provides cover for anyone who might ask questions about why people periodically disappear from Harksworth. I thought about Jasmine's terror when she'd begged me to leave town, the way she'd glanced fearfully toward the forest, her insistence that some stories weren't meant to be told. She knew. She understood exactly what was going to happen to her tomorrow night, but she was powerless to stop it. The good fortune is real, isn't it? I asked. Everything Jasmine told me about her family's success, Kyle's promotion, their house, her career advancement, that actually happened. Oh, yes, Glenn nodded grimly. The luckbringer keeps his end of the bargain. The chosen person receives a year of genuine good fortune. Their lives improve in every measurable way. Financial success, career advancement, personal fulfillment, health improvements, relationship healing, whatever they need most, they receive in abundance. The cruelty of it was staggering. Not only did the entity take people's lives, but it gave them a taste of everything they'd ever wanted first. It was psychological torture disguised as a blessing, making the eventual sacrifice even more devastating for both the victim and their loved ones. But when the next ceremony arrives, I said, already knowing the answer, they have to fulfill their obligation. They walk into the forest willingly, Glenn confirmed. The luckbringer's influence grows stronger throughout the year, especially in the final weeks. By the time the ceremony arrives, they've accepted their fate. They understand their role in maintaining the community's prosperity. I set down my pen and rubbed my temples, trying to process everything I'd learned. This wasn't just a story about small-town secrets or local folklore. This was about systematic supernatural predation that had been going on for decades, claiming dozens of lives while an entire community remained complicit through fear and dependence on the benefits. Has anyone ever tried to intervene? I asked. To help the chosen person escape or refuse to participate? Glenn's expression darkened. A few times in the early years after we reinstated the tribute, family members who didn't fully understand the situation, mostly. People who thought they could hide the chosen person or convince them to leave town. What happened to them? The same thing that happened during the 5 years we broke the pact, Glenn said quietly. Accidents, sudden illnesses, mechanical failures at precisely the wrong moment. The message was always clear. The arrangement is not to be interfered with. My hands were shaking now as I picked up my pen again. The implications were terrifying, but I had to ask the next question. What about law enforcement? Surely someone has investigated when people go missing. Oh, they have, Glenn said with a bitter laugh. Every few years we get visits from county sheriffs or state police, following up on missing persons reports filed by relatives in other towns. They interview residents, search the forest, examine records, but they never find any evidence of foul play. Because there isn't any, I realized. If the chosen ones walk into the forest willingly. Exactly. No signs of struggle, no evidence of coercion, no witnesses to any crime. The investigators see a prosperous, peaceful community where everyone speaks highly of the missing person. They find documentation of the Luckiest Citizen Award, photographs of the ceremony, testimony about how honored and happy the recipient seemed. As far as the law is concerned, these are adults who chose to leave town for personal reasons and simply haven't maintained contact with their families. The systematic nature of the cover-up was as disturbing as the supernatural elements. This wasn't just about one entity preying on a community. It was about an entire population working together to enable and conceal that predation, generation after generation. Jasmine knows, I said. It wasn't a question, but Glenn nodded anyway. She's known for months now. The influence grows gradually, but by this point in the year, she understands exactly what's expected of her tomorrow night. The terror you saw today, That's the last of her resistance burning away. By tomorrow evening, she'll be calm, accepting, even eager to fulfill her obligation. The thought of Jasmine's fear being systematically erased, her will being overridden by supernatural compulsion, made me feel physically ill. I thought about her daughter Sadie, about Kyle coming home to find his wife simply gone, about the family photographs showing their progression from modest apartment to dream house, all of it built on borrowed time. "Is there any way to stop it?" I asked desperately. "Any way to break the cycle without bringing down the kind of retribution you experienced in the 50s? Glenn was quiet for a long time, staring into his whiskey glass as if searching for answers in the amber depths. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with decades of helplessness and guilt. "I've spent 70 years thinking about that question," he said. 70 years watching good people walk into those trees, knowing I was complicit in their deaths because I was too afraid to act. And I've never found an answer that doesn't end with more people dying. The weight of his words settled over the room like a physical presence. I realized that Glenn wasn't just the village historian. He was a man who'd spent most of his life carrying the burden of terrible knowledge, watching the same tragedy play out year after year, powerless to prevent it without risking even greater catastrophe. "The Luckbringer doesn't just take one person annually," Glenn continued. "That's the minimum required to maintain the pact. If the arrangement is threatened, if someone tries to interfere or expose the truth, the entity is perfectly capable of taking more lives to protect itself. The accidents during the 1950s proved that." I thought about my own presence in Harksworth, about the article I'd planned to write, about the questions I'd been asking throughout the village. Was I putting other people at risk just by being here? Was my investigation potentially signing death warrants for innocent residents? "Then why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Why risk talking to an outsider if it could bring retribution down on the community?" Glenn met my eyes directly, and I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A flicker of desperate hope mixed with the resignation and guilt. "Because maybe," he said slowly, "maybe someone from outside the system, someone not bound by decades of fear and complicity, might see something we've missed. Maybe there's a solution that none of us have been able to find because we're too close to the problem, too invested in our own survival." It was a slim hope, barely more than wishful thinking, but I understood why he was clinging to it. After 70 years of watching people die, even the smallest possibility of change would be worth the risk. "What happens tomorrow night?" I asked. "During the ceremony?" "The entire village gathers in the town square at sunset," Glenn explained. "There are speeches about community spirit and shared prosperity, presentations about Jasmine's contributions to local life, expressions of gratitude for her service. Very formal, very dignified. And then, as the sun disappears behind the mountains, she walks to the edge of the forest. Alone? Alone. She enters the trees, and we never see her again. The next morning, life returns to normal. Her family receives condolences for her sudden decision to leave town, help packing up her belongings, support during their difficult transition. Within a few months, they usually move away to start fresh somewhere else. The clinical description made it sound almost reasonable, like a natural community ritual rather than supernatural human sacrifice. I could see how outside investigators might view it as nothing more than an elaborate farewell ceremony for someone choosing to relocate. "And Kyle and Sadie have no idea what's really happening?" "The Luckbringer's influence extends to family members, but more subtly," Glenn said. "They'll feel sad about Jasmine's departure, but they won't question it. They'll accept her explanation that she needs to pursue new opportunities, that this is what's best for everyone. The supernatural compulsion ensures they don't dig too deeply into details that might unravel the cover story." I closed my notebook and leaned back in my chair, overwhelmed by everything I'd learned. Tomorrow night, I would watch a woman walk to her death while her husband and daughter stood by peacefully, their minds clouded by supernatural influence. An entire community would participate in what amounted to ritual murder, and law enforcement would find no evidence of any crime. "How many people have you watched die this way?" I asked quietly. 68, Glenn said without hesitation. 68 people in the years since we reinstated the tribute, plus the 17 who died during the 5 years we tried to break the pact. 85 deaths that I could have prevented if I'd been braver, or smarter, or more willing to sacrifice myself for others. The guilt in his voice was devastating. I realized that Glenn had been carrying this burden alone for decades, watching the annual cycle repeat while being unable to share the truth with anyone who might help. No wonder he looked so frail. The weight of 85 deaths would crush anyone's spirit. "You couldn't have saved them," I said, though the words felt inadequate. "Not without risking everyone else in the village." "Maybe," Glenn said. Or maybe I just told myself that to make the guilt easier to bear. We sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in our own thoughts. Outside, I could hear the normal sounds of evening in a small town. Doors closing, cars starting, families settling in for the night. It was impossible to reconcile that peaceful normalcy with the horror Glenn had just described. "Jasmine knows what awaits her tomorrow night," I finally said. "And she's going to walk into that forest willingly because the Luckbringer's influence will make her want to." Glenn nodded slowly. "That's how it works. They go of their own accord, leaving no trace of struggle or coercion behind." I sat in Glenn's living room for what felt like hours after he finished talking, staring at the empty whiskey glass in my hands, the weight of everything he'd told me pressed down like a physical force. 85 people, 70 years of systematic murder disguised as tradition. And tomorrow night, Jasmine would walk into those trees of her own accord because some supernatural entity had spent a year conditioning her to want it. The rational part of my mind, the journalist part, kept trying to find holes in Glenn's story. Maybe the old man was delusional. Maybe decades of guilt over some unrelated tragedies had twisted his perception of reality. But I couldn't shake the memory of Jasmine's terror when she'd begged me to leave, or the way every single villager had known exactly who I was and why I was here. Glenn walked me to his door sometime after 9, his face gray with exhaustion. We didn't say much. What was there to say? He'd given me the truth I'd come looking for, and now I had to decide what to do with it. The walk back to the inn felt surreal. Normal sounds drifted from the houses I passed. Television programs, running water, families settling in for the night. Children's laughter echoed from an upstairs window. A dog barked somewhere in the distance, all the ordinary rhythms of small-town evening life, continuing as if Glenn hadn't just told me that this place was built on decades of human sacrifice. I made it to my room without seeing Avery, which was probably for the best. I wasn't sure I could look at her knowing what I now knew about her role in all this. She'd directed me to Glenn, yes, but only after I'd pushed her. How many reporters had she turned away over the years? How many potential witnesses had she steered clear of the truth? Sleep was impossible. I lay on the narrow bed with my notebook open beside me, reading through everything I'd written. Glenn's words, Jasmine's warnings, the careful non-answers from every other villager. The pattern was undeniable once you knew what to look for. Around midnight, I considered calling the police. My cell phone still had no signal, but the inn had a landline. I could reach the county sheriff, report what Glenn had told me. But then I remembered his warning about previous investigations finding nothing. Of course, they'd found nothing. The victims left willingly, their families accepted their departure, and the entire community backed up the same story about a harmless local tradition. What evidence did I actually have? The testimony of one elderly man who could easily be dismissed as confused or mentally unstable, a frightened woman who'd explicitly refused to go on record, a community that showed signs of coordinated behavior but nothing provably criminal, no bodies, no crime scene, no physical evidence of any wrongdoing. I'd covered enough police investigations to know how this would go. A couple of officers would drive up from the county seat, ask some routine questions, and leave satisfied that they'd looked into a crank call from an out-of-town journalist. The villagers would be polite and cooperative, explaining their quaint local tradition with just the right mix of pride and embarrassment. Jasmine would smile and tell them how honored she felt to receive the award. Everything would appear completely normal. The worst part was knowing that in 24 hours it would be over. Whatever window existed for intervention would close at sunset tomorrow. After that, Jasmine would be gone, and Harksworth would begin its quiet process of selecting next year's victim. I must have dozed fitfully sometime before dawn, because I woke to pale morning light filtering through the thin curtains. My notebook had fallen to the floor during the night, pages scattered. I gathered them up, checking that Glenn's revelations were all still there in my handwriting. Part of me had hoped I'd dreamed the whole conversation. Downstairs, Avery had coffee and pastries laid out in the small dining room. She greeted me with the same professional pleasantness as always, but I caught her watching me more carefully now. She knew I'd spoken with Glenn. She was probably wondering how much he'd told me. "Sleep well?" she asked, refilling my coffee cup. "Fine," I lied. "Will you be staying another night? I know you mentioned your article deadline." The question felt loaded. Was she hoping I'd leave before the ceremony? Or was she simply making conversation? "I haven't decided yet," I said. She nodded and retreated to the kitchen, leaving me alone with my coffee and the growing certainty that I couldn't just walk away. By mid-morning, I was back on the village streets, ostensibly continuing my interviews, but really trying to figure out what to do. The ceremony preparations were already underway. I watched from the general store's front steps as a group of women hung garlands of flowers around the gazebo in the town square. Their movements were efficient, practiced. They'd done this before, many times. Jimmy Bailey emerged from his store carrying boxes of what looked like party supplies. When he saw me watching, he managed a tight smile. "Big day tomorrow," he said. "So I understand. This is quite an honor for Jasmine." His smile faltered slightly. "Yes, she's very deserving." The word came out strained, like he'd had to force himself to say it. I wondered how many times he'd watched this same scene play out. How many neighbors he'd seen decorated and celebrated before they disappeared forever. "Have you known her long?" I asked. "Few years, nice family. Kyle's good people too. It must be hard seeing her leave for new opportunities." Bailey's face went carefully blank. "That's life in a small town. People move on." He headed back into his store without another word, but I caught the way his hands shook as he fumbled with his keys. The rest of the morning brought more of the same. Villagers going about their preparations with forced normalcy, their faces showing the strain of maintaining the pretense. Children helped their parents hang banners and arrange chairs, chattering excitedly about the party. They seemed genuinely happy, which somehow made everything worse. The kids didn't know what they were celebrating. I found myself standing at the edge of the town square around noon, watching the setup continue. The gazebo had been transformed with flowers and ribbons. A small platform had been erected nearby, probably for speeches. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing the platform. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, a community celebration honoring one of their own. That's when I decided I had to try talking to Jasmine again. The walk to Maple Street felt different this time. Yesterday, I'd been looking for a story. Today, I was looking for a way to save someone's life. The distinction made my stomach clench with anxiety. The Ortiz house looked the same as before, perfectly maintained, prosperous, normal. But when Jasmine answered my knock, I immediately saw the change Glenn had warned me about. Her face held an otherworldly calm that made my skin crawl. The terror from yesterday was completely gone. replaced by something that looked like serenity but felt profoundly wrong. Her blue eyes seemed to focus on something beyond me, and when she smiled, it didn't quite reach those eyes. "Frederick," she said, as if she'd been expecting me. "Please, come in." I followed her to the same living room where we'd talked before, but everything felt different now. She moved with a dreamlike quality, her gestures smooth and deliberate. When she offered tea, I declined. "Jasmine, we need to talk about tomorrow night." "The ceremony," she said, settling into her chair with that same eerie calm. "Yes, it's time. You don't have to go through with this. I know what the award really means. I know what happens in the forest." She tilted her head slightly, considering my words with mild curiosity rather than alarm. "Of course you do, Glenn told you." The casual way she said it sent chills down my spine. Yesterday, she'd been terrified that I might learn the truth. Today, she seemed completely unbothered by my knowledge. "Jasmine, listen to me. You're in danger. This isn't really a choice you're making freely. Something is influencing your thoughts, making you want to do this." "I understand now," she said, her voice carrying that same dreamy quality. The year of luck was payment in advance. Everything we received, Kyle's promotion, the house, my career, even Sadie, it was all given to us with the understanding that I would fulfill my part of the bargain. That's not how it works. You don't owe anyone anything. These aren't debts that need to be paid. She looked at me with something approaching pity. "You don't understand." The Luckbringer kept his side of the agreement. It would be wrong not to keep mine. I leaned forward, trying to reach whatever part of her real personality might still be accessible. "What about Sadie? What about Kyle? They need you. They'll be fine. They'll understand that this was always meant to happen." The matter-of-fact way she said it made my chest tighten. This wasn't the same woman who'd grabbed my arm yesterday and begged me to leave town. Whatever the Luckbringer was, it had been working on her mind all year, and now it had complete control. "Jasmine, I'm a journalist. I can expose this story. I can bring outside attention that will stop this from happening." She shook her head gently. "Some stories aren't meant to be told, Frederick. You know that." She was using the same words from yesterday, but now they carried no urgency or fear. They sounded like simple statements of fact. "I have a car," I said, abandoning any pretense of journalistic objectivity. "We can leave right now. I can drive you anywhere you want to go. You don't have to be here tomorrow night." For a moment, something flickered in her eyes, a brief shadow of confusion or uncertainty. But it passed quickly, replaced by that unsettling serenity. "Why would I want to leave? This is where I belong. Tomorrow night I'll go where I'm supposed to go." I tried for another hour, approaching the problem from every angle I could think of. I appealed to her maternal instincts, her sense of self-preservation, her love for her family. I explained what Glenn had told me about the supernatural influence, hoping that understanding might help her fight it. I offered to contact authorities, to bring in outside help, to do whatever it took to keep her safe. Nothing worked. She listened to everything I said with polite attention, occasionally nodding as if I was making interesting but irrelevant points. When I described the fate of previous award winners, she showed no fear. When I explained that she was being manipulated, she showed no anger. When I begged her to think about her daughter growing up without a mother, she simply smiled and said Sadie would understand when she was older. The worst part was how reasonable she sounded. Her responses weren't the ranting of someone who'd lost their mind. They were calm, thoughtful, and utterly convinced. She genuinely believed that walking into the forest tomorrow night was the right thing to do. By the time I left her house, I was shaking with frustration and horror. The woman I'd spoken with today wasn't really Jasmine Ortiz anymore. She was something else, a puppet wearing Jasmine's face, programmed to fulfill a supernatural contract. I stood on her front porch for several minutes after she closed the door, staring at the cheerful yellow paint and perfectly arranged flower boxes. Behind that normal facade, a mother was calmly preparing to abandon her family forever, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do to stop it. The Luckbringer's influence had already taken hold of her mind completely, just as Glenn had warned it would. Tomorrow night, she would walk into those trees willingly, convinced she was doing the right thing, and everyone who loved her would watch it happen. The afternoon dragged by with agonizing slowness. I spent most of it in my room, staring at my notes and trying to think of something, anything I could do to stop what was going to happen. Every plan I came up with fell apart under scrutiny. Call the police? Tell them what exactly? That a supernatural entity was going to claim a willing sacrifice? They'd think I'd lost my mind. Try to physically intervene. Glenn had made it clear what happened to people who interfered with the Luckbringer's arrangements. Besides, Jasmine wasn't being held against her will. She wanted to go. That was the most horrifying part of all this. Around 4 o'clock, I gave up pretending I had any real options. I packed my recorder and notebook into my satchel, checked that my pen worked, and headed downstairs. Whatever was about to happen, I was going to document it. Maybe that was all I could do. Bear witness. Make sure someone outside this place knew what really went on here, even if I could never publish it. Avery was behind the front desk when I came down, organizing papers with the same mechanical precision she brought to everything else. She looked up as I crossed the lobby, and I saw something flicker across her face. Relief, maybe, or resignation. "You're staying for the ceremony," she said. It wasn't a question. Yes. She nodded slowly, her hands stilling on the papers. "Glenn told you everything, didn't he?" "He did. I thought he might." She glanced toward the front windows where the late afternoon light was starting to take on that golden quality that meant sunset wasn't far off. "He's been carrying it alone for so long. We all have, I suppose, but Glenn..." She trailed off, shaking her head. "He remembers when it started. The rest of us just grew up with it." I wanted to ask her how she lived with it. How any of them did. How they went about their daily lives, knowing that every year, someone walked into those trees and never came back. But I could see in her face that she'd been asking herself the same questions for decades. "The ceremony starts at 6, she said instead. "In the town square." "I know. You can't stop it, you understand that." "I understand." She studied my face for a long moment, then returned to her papers. "Be careful, Mr. Armstrong. Some things are bigger than good intentions." I left the inn and walked toward the town square, my satchel heavy against my shoulder. The village looked the same as it had every day since I'd arrived, perfectly maintained, artificially pristine. But there was an undercurrent of tension in the air now. People moved with purpose, making final preparations for the evening's event. Children ran between the adults, excited about the celebration, unaware of what they were really celebrating. The square itself had been transformed. The gazebo was draped with white fabric and covered in flowers, roses, lilies, baby's breath, all arranged with the same obsessive perfection that characterized everything else in Harksworth. A small platform had been erected in front of the gazebo, with a microphone and a lectern. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows facing the platform, enough seating for the entire village population. I found a spot at the edge of the square near the corner of Jimmy Bailey's store where I could observe without being too conspicuous. From there, I had a clear view of both the platform and the forest path that led away from the village center toward the tree line. That path looked innocuous enough in the daylight, just a dirt track winding between houses and gardens before disappearing into the shadows beneath the trees. But knowing what I knew now, it felt like looking at a mouth waiting to swallow someone whole. People began gathering around 5:30. They came in family groups, dressed in their best clothes, carrying flowers and small wrapped gifts. The atmosphere was festive on the surface, neighbors greeting each other, children playing between the chairs, elderly residents settling into seats with cushions and blankets. But underneath the celebration, I could see the tension Glenn had described. Forced smiles that didn't reach people's eyes. Conversations that stayed carefully on safe topics. Glances toward the forest path that were quickly looked away from. I recognized most of the faces by now. Jimmy Bailey, looking uncomfortable in a suit that was too tight around his collar. Irene Willis, clutching a bouquet of flowers from her perfect garden. The elderly woman with the dog. The man who'd been working in his yard. All the others who'd refused to talk to me about previous award winners. They all knew what was really happening here. They'd all watched it happen before. At 10 minutes to 6, a black sedan pulled up at the edge of the square. Kyle Ortiz got out first, a tall man with dark hair and the kind of outdoorsy tan that came from working in forestry. He moved around to the passenger side and helped Sadie out of her car seat. She was maybe 4 years old, blonde like her mother, wearing a frilly white dress and carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers. Then Jasmine emerged from the car. She was wearing a flowing white dress that looked almost bridal. Her blonde hair loose around her shoulders, her blue eyes bright and distant. She moved with that same dreamlike quality I'd noticed at her house, but now it was more pronounced. She seemed to float rather than walk, her steps measured and deliberate, her face serene in a way that made my stomach clench with dread. Kyle took her arm, and they walked toward the platform together, Sadie skipping alongside them. The crowd parted to let them through, and I heard murmurs of appreciation and congratulation. She looks beautiful. Such an honor. Well deserved. The words felt obscene given what I knew was coming. The family took seats in the front row, Jasmine in the center with Kyle on one side and Sadie on the other. Sadie was chattering excitedly about something, gesturing with her little bouquet. But Jasmine's responses were distant, automatic. She was there, but not there, present in body, but already gone in some fundamental way. At exactly 6 o'clock, Glenn Dominguez stepped up to the lectern. He looked older than he had yesterday, more fragile, the weight of what he was about to participate in visible in every line of his face. He tapped the microphone, and the crowd fell silent. "Friends," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "We gather tonight to honor one of our own. Jasmine Ortiz has been selected as this year's recipient of the Luckiest Citizen Award, in recognition of her outstanding contributions to our community." The crowd applauded politely. Sadie clapped enthusiastically, beaming up at her mother. Jasmine smiled and nodded, accepting the recognition with that eerie calm. Glenn continued with a speech about Jasmine's volunteer work, her dedication to community fundraisers, her role at the bank. All true, I supposed, but it felt like a eulogy delivered to a living person. He talked about the award's long tradition, its significance to the village, the honor of being chosen. The words were carefully crafted to mean one thing to those who knew the truth, and something entirely different to any outsider who might be listening. Other villagers took turns at the microphone. Jimmy Bailey talked about Jasmine's kindness and generosity. Irene Willis praised her dedication to making Harksworth a better place. A teacher from the local school spoke about Jasmine's work with children's programs. Each speech felt like another shovel full of dirt on a grave. Throughout it all, Jasmine sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, that distant smile never wavering. Kyle held Sadie on his lap, pointing out speakers and whispering explanations in her ear. He looked proud, happy even, as if this really was just a community celebration honoring his wife. The supernatural influence Glenn had mentioned was clearly affecting him too, making him see what he needed to see to get through this. The formal presentations came next. Flowers, a framed certificate, a small wooden plaque with Jasmine's name engraved on it. She accepted each gift graciously, standing to hug the presenters, posing for photographs. The whole thing had the surreal quality of a dream, or maybe a nightmare disguised as something pleasant. I found myself taking notes automatically, my pen moving across the page without conscious thought. Part of my mind was cataloging details, the time, the weather, the exact words being spoken, while another part was screaming internally at the sheer wrongness of it all. These people were celebrating a murder. They were honoring a sacrifice. They were saying goodbye to someone who would be dead before morning, and they were doing it with flowers and speeches and polite applause. As the ceremony progressed, I noticed the subtle changes in the crowd's behavior. The initial forced festivity was giving way to something else, a kind of nervous anticipation. People checked their watches more frequently. Conversations became shorter, more strained. Children were hushed when they got too loud. Everyone was waiting for something, and that something was approaching fast. The sun was getting lower, casting long shadows across the square. The light was taking on that deep golden quality that comes just before sunset, and I could feel the tension in the air ratcheting up with each passing minute. This was really going to happen. In a matter of minutes, Jasmine Ortiz was going to walk into those trees, and everyone here was going to let her do it. At 6:45, Glenn returned to the microphone for the final speech. His hands were shaking as he gripped the lectern, and his voice was rougher than it had been at the beginning. "The time has come," he said, and the words seemed to carry more weight than they should have. "Jasmine, the community thanks you for your service. We wish you well on your journey." Jasmine rose from her chair with fluid grace, smoothing down her white dress. She hugged Kyle, who held her close for a long moment, his face buried in her hair. When they separated, I could see tears in his eyes, but his expression was peaceful, accepting. He believed she was leaving for something good, something right. She knelt down to Sadie's level, taking the little girl's hands in hers. Sadie gave her the wildflower bouquet, and Jasmine accepted it with the first genuine smile I'd seen from her all evening. "Be good for Daddy," Jasmine said, her voice carrying clearly in the still air. "Mommy loves you very much." "I love you too, Mommy," Sadie replied, throwing her arms around Jasmine's neck. "When are you coming home?" "Soon, sweetheart. Very soon." The lie hit me like a physical blow. I gripped my pen so hard it left marks on my fingers, fighting the urge to stand up and scream the truth at everyone assembled there. But what good would it do? They all knew. Even Kyle and Sadie, on some level, had to know. The supernatural influence might be clouding their judgment, but the knowledge was there underneath. Jasmine stood and turned toward the forest path. The crowd rose with her, a silent procession following as she began to walk. I fell in behind them, my recorder running in my pocket, my notebook clutched in my hands. I felt like I was documenting something obscene, but I couldn't stop myself. Someone had to witness this. Someone had to remember. The walk to the tree line took maybe 10 minutes. Jasmine moved at an unhurried pace, her white dress flowing around her, the wildflower bouquet bright against the fabric. The villagers followed in respectful silence, their footsteps muffled on the dirt path. Children walked hand in hand with their parents, their earlier excitement replaced by a solemnity they probably didn't understand. At the edge of the forest, Jasmine stopped. The path continued into the trees, disappearing into shadows that seemed deeper and darker than they should have been. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and there was a stillness in the air that felt unnatural, oppressive. The crowd formed a semicircle behind her, giving her space but close enough to see everything that happened next. I positioned myself at the back, trying to stay inconspicuous while keeping my eyes fixed on Jasmine. This was it. This was the moment Glenn had described, when the chosen one walked willingly into the darkness to fulfill their obligation to the luck-bringer. Jasmine turned back to face the assembled villagers, and for a moment her gaze swept across the crowd. When her eyes found mine, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. She looked at me for a long moment, her blue eyes clear and focused in a way they hadn't been all evening. "Mr. Armstrong," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent gathering. "You came to write a story about our tradition." I nodded, not trusting my voice. "Don't write this story," she continued, her tone gentle but firm. "Some secrets protect more than they harm. Some truths are too dangerous to tell." "Jasmine," I started, but she held up a hand to stop me. "This is my choice," she said. "My obligation. My gift to this community and my family. Let it remain what it appears to be. A celebration of good fortune and community spirit. Nothing more." She turned back toward the forest path, took 3 steps forward, and vanished into the darkness between the trees. One moment she was there, a figure in white moving through the shadows, and the next she was simply gone, swallowed by the forest as completely as if she had never existed. The crowd stood in silence for a long time after she disappeared. I kept waiting for someone to follow her, to call out, to react with the horror and grief that such a moment deserved. But they just stood there, staring at the spot where she had vanished, their faces reflecting the same mixture of sorrow and acceptance I'd seen throughout the evening. Gradually, people began to drift away. Families gathered their children and walked back toward the village, speaking in hushed tones or not at all. Kyle picked up Sadie, who had fallen asleep standing up, and carried her back to their car. He moved like a man in a trance, functioning on autopilot, while his conscious mind processed what had just happened. I remained at the tree line long after everyone else had gone, staring into the forest and waiting for something, anything, to happen. For Jasmine to come back, for screams to echo from the darkness, for some sign of what was happening to her in there. But the forest remained silent and still, giving up no secrets. Hours passed. The moon rose, casting silver light through the branches. I sat on a fallen log and waited, my recorder still running, my notebook open on my lap. But Jasmine never emerged from those trees, and eventually, I had to accept that she never would. I stayed at the forest edge long after the last villager disappeared down the path. The moon had climbed higher, casting everything in silver, but the trees ahead remained dark as a cave mouth. My recorder kept running in my hand, the tiny red light blinking steadily, capturing nothing but silence. Hours passed. 3, maybe 4. I kept thinking I heard something, a branch snapping, footsteps on dead leaves, maybe even Jasmine calling out. But every time I held my breath and listened, there was nothing. The temperature dropped as the night wore on. I pulled my jacket tighter and shifted on the fallen log where I'd been sitting, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. What if she came back? What if whatever was in there released her? The rational part of my mind knew better. Glenn's stories, the photographs on his wall, 70 years of this same ritual. Jasmine wasn't coming back. But I couldn't stop hoping. Around 2 in the morning, I finally gave up. My legs had gone stiff from sitting, and my hands were numb from the cold. I clicked off the recorder and closed my notebook, then made my way back through the village. Every house was dark, every window black. The decorations from the ceremony were still up, the white fabric draped over the gazebo, the folding chairs arranged in neat rows. In the moonlight, it looked like the aftermath of a wedding that had ended badly. The inn was quiet when I let myself in. I climbed the stairs to room 7, my footsteps echoing in the hallway. Once inside, I set my satchel on the bed and pulled out my notebook. I had pages of notes now. Glenn's story, my conversations with Jasmine, descriptions of the ceremony, timestamps and details. Everything I needed to write the story of my career. Everything I needed to expose what was happening in Harksworth. I sat at the small desk by the window and opened my laptop. The screen's blue glow felt harsh after hours in the darkness. I stared at the blank document, cursor blinking, waiting for me to start typing. But my hands wouldn't move to the keyboard. What exactly was I going to write? That a village in the mountains was feeding people to some supernatural entity in exchange for prosperity? That I'd watched a woman walk into the forest and disappear? Who would believe it? My editor would think I'd lost my mind. The police would dismiss it as a missing person case, if they even bothered to investigate. Jasmine's family would tell them she'd left voluntarily, which was technically true. There would be no evidence of foul play, no signs of struggle, no body to find. I closed the laptop and walked to the window. The village spread out below me, peaceful and perfect in the moonlight. Somewhere out there, Kyle Ortiz was sleeping next to an empty bed, probably dreaming pleasant dreams about his wife's new opportunities. Sadie was curled up in her room, clutching the wildflower bouquet her mother had given her, believing Mommy would come home soon. The supernatural influence Glenn had described was still working on them, making Jasmine's disappearance seem natural and right. But what about me? I wasn't under any influence. I knew exactly what had happened. I'd watched it unfold, documented every detail. Didn't I have an obligation to tell the truth? Wasn't that what journalism was supposed to be about? I thought about my editor back at the Regional Herald, probably expecting a cheerful piece about small-town traditions and community spirit, something light and heartwarming to fill space between the crime reports and political coverage. He had no idea what he'd sent me into. I paced the small room, my mind racing. Maybe I could find a way to make people believe. Maybe if I went back to Glenn, convinced him to go on record, got him to show me those old photographs. Maybe if I documented the pattern of disappearances, tracked down relatives of previous award winners, built a case that couldn't be dismissed. But even as I thought it, I knew it was impossible. Glenn had spent 70 years keeping this secret. He'd only told me because he was desperate, hoping an outsider might find a solution he'd missed. He wasn't going to risk his life by going public. And the relatives of previous victims, they probably believed their loved ones had moved away for better opportunities, just like Kyle and Sadie believed about Jasmine. The supernatural influence didn't just affect the immediate family. It created a whole narrative that made sense to everyone. I sat back down at the desk and opened my notebook, flipping through the pages of notes. Jasmine's terror yesterday, when she'd begged me to leave town. Her eerie calm today, when she'd accepted her fate with supernatural serenity. The way she'd looked at me at the forest edge, speaking my name, warning me not to write the story. Some secrets protect more than they harm, she'd said. Some truths are too dangerous to tell. I dismissed it as the supernatural influence talking, but now I wondered if there was more to it. What would happen if I did publish the story? Even if people believed it, even if it somehow led to an investigation, what then? Glenn had told me what happened when the village tried to break the pact in the 1950s. 17 people dead in 5 years. Crop failures, business disasters, fatal accidents that weren't really accidents. Would exposing Harksworth's secret save future victims? Or would it just trigger another round of supernatural retribution? Would I be responsible for more deaths, not fewer? I thought about the children I'd seen during the ceremony preparations, playing in the streets while their parents hung decorations. Innocent kids who had no idea what their community was built on. If the pact was broken, would they pay the price? Would their parents start dying in accidents until someone agreed to reinstate the tribute? The questions went around and around in my head as the night wore on. I must have dozed at some point, because I woke up with my head on the desk, my notebook stuck to my cheek. Gray light was filtering through the window. Dawn was coming, and I hadn't made any progress toward a decision. I stood up and stretched, my neck stiff from sleeping at the desk. Outside, the village was starting to wake up. I could see smoke rising from a few chimneys, the early stirrings of another normal day in Harksworth. By tonight, the ceremony decorations would probably be taken down. The folding chairs stacked away, the flowers composted. Life would go on as if Jasmine Ortiz had never existed. A soft knock at my door interrupted my thoughts. I opened it to find Avery Day standing in the hallway, fully dressed despite the early hour. She was carrying a coffee tray, steam rising from the ceramic mug. "Thought you might need this," she said, offering me the tray. "Long night." I accepted the coffee gratefully. It was strong and black, exactly what I needed. You could say that. Avery lingered in the doorway, her eyes taking in my rumpled clothes, the notebook open on the desk, the obvious signs that I hadn't slept properly. "Glenn told you everything, didn't he?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. "And now you're trying to decide what to do about it." Another nod. Avery sighed, suddenly looking older than her 50-something years. "I've been the innkeeper here for 23 years. You're not the first reporter who's come asking questions, though you're the first one Glenn actually talked to." That surprised me. "Other reporters have been here?" 3 or 4 over the years. Usually someone gets curious about our prosperity, or they hear rumors about people disappearing. They come asking the same questions you asked, get the same non-answers from the same people. Most of them leave after a day or two, write their little puff pieces about quaint mountain villages. But a couple were more persistent. "What happened to them?" Avery's expression darkened. "They had accidents, car crashes on the mountain roads mostly. Terrible tragedies. Real shame." She paused, letting the implication sink in. "The thing is, Mr. Armstrong, Harksworth has been taking care of itself for a very long time. It doesn't like being threatened." I set down the coffee mug, my hand suddenly unsteady. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm warning you. Same as Jasmine tried to warn you. Same as Glenn probably warned you, in his own way." Avery stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You seem like a decent man. You don't deserve to end up wrapped around a tree on Highway 12 because your brakes failed. But that's what'll happen if you try to expose us. So I should just pretend I never saw anything. Write a nice story about your community spirit and go home. That would be the smart thing to do, yes." I stared at her, this ordinary-looking woman in her apron and sensible shoes, calmly discussing my potential murder. "How do you live with yourselves? How do you sleep at night knowing what you do to people?" For the first time, Avery's composure cracked slightly. Her shoulders sagged, and I saw genuine pain in her eyes. "You think we don't feel it? You think it's easy watching good people walk into those trees year after year? Jasmine wasn't the first one I've served breakfast to, knowing it would be her last morning with her family. She won't be the last. Then why don't you stop it? Because we tried that once, and 17 people died. Because I have grandchildren in this village, and I want them to grow up safe and fed and happy. Because sometimes the choice isn't between good and evil. It's between one evil and a worse one." She straightened up, the moment of vulnerability passing. "The bus comes through at 11:15 this morning. I suggest you be on it. Your room is paid through today, so there's no rush to pack. But don't linger, Mr. Armstrong. Don't make this harder than it has to be." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my coffee and my conscience. I closed the door and leaned against it, my mind reeling. The implicit threat was clear enough. Leave quietly and write a harmless story, or end up as roadkill on the mountain highway. It wasn't really a choice at all. I looked around the room one more time. My satchel sat on the bed, containing my recorder and notebook full of evidence. Evidence that would probably get me killed if I tried to use it. Evidence of a horror that would continue whether I exposed it or not. I thought about Jasmine's final words to me. Some secrets protect more than they harm. Some truths are too dangerous to tell. At the time, I'd assumed the supernatural influence was making her say it. But what if she'd been trying to save my life? What if she'd known exactly what would happen to me if I tried to publish her story? The coffee was getting cold in my hands, but I barely noticed. I was thinking about all the other reporters who'd come here before me, the ones who'd had accidents on the mountain roads. Had they figured out the truth too? Had they tried to expose it, only to discover that some stories came with a death sentence? I walked back to the desk and looked down at my notebook. Pages and pages of careful documentation, timestamps and quotes and observations. Everything I needed to write the story of my career. Everything I needed to destroy my life. The cursor was still blinking on my laptop screen, waiting for me to start typing. But I knew now that I never would. Not this story. Not if I wanted to live to write another one. I closed the notebook and put it back in my satchel along with my recorder. Then I started packing my clothes, folding them carefully into my bag. The bus would be here in a few hours, and I intended to be on it. Some stories were too dangerous to tell. Some truths were too costly to reveal. Jasmine had understood that, even at the end. Now I understood it too. The weight of that terrible knowledge settled on my shoulders as I zipped up my bag. I would carry it with me for the rest of my life, this secret about what really happened in Harksworth. But I would never write about it, never speak of it, never try to save the next Jasmine Ortiz, because some prices were too high to pay, even for the truth. The inn felt smaller in the morning light. I sat on the edge of the bed, my packed satchel beside me, listening to the sounds of a village going about its business. Doors opening and closing, voices calling greetings, the rhythmic scrape of someone sweeping their front steps, normal sounds from normal people who had watched a woman walk into the forest last night and would spend today pretending it never happened. My notebook lay open on the nightstand where I'd left it after Avery's visit. Pages of careful handwriting documenting the impossible. Glenn's weathered face as he counted off the dead. Jasmine's blue eyes, empty and serene, as she told me some truths were too dangerous to tell. The way the crowd had stood in perfect silence as she disappeared into those trees. I closed the notebook and slipped it into my satchel next to the recorder. The weight felt different now. Not just equipment and notes, but evidence of something I'd never be able to prove, something I'd never even try to prove. The bus arrived at 11:15 exactly, rumbling to a stop at the same gravel patch where I'd been dropped off 3 days ago. 3 days. It felt like months. The driver was different this time, a younger guy who barely glanced at me as I climbed aboard. I took a seat near the back and watched through the window as Harksworth shrank behind us, the perfect little village nestled in its valley like a postcard picture. The bus wound up through the mountain roads, past stands of pine and aspen that looked exactly the same as they had when I'd arrived. But I knew now what lived in those forests, what waited in the shadows between the trees. The luckbringer, whatever it was, patient and ancient and hungry, feeding on the desperate bargains people made when they had nowhere else to turn. My phone buzzed as we reached higher ground and picked up a signal. 3 missed calls from my editor, Frank. A text asking where my story was. I turned the phone face down and kept watching the trees roll by. The countryside opened up as we descended toward the valley where the Regional Herald had its offices. Farmland and strip malls and gas stations. The real world where supernatural bargains were the stuff of horror movies and small-town legends. Where a story about a village sacrificing people to a forest creature would get you laughed out of any newsroom in the country. I thought about Jasmine's family. Kyle would wake up this morning in their perfect house, probably make breakfast for Sadie, get her ready for school. Maybe he'd mention that Mommy had left for her new opportunity, just like they'd discussed. Sadie would ask when she was coming back, and Kyle would give her some vague answer about how these things took time. The supernatural influence Glenn had described would make it all seem reasonable, natural, just the way things worked out sometimes. In a few weeks, maybe a month, Kyle would start dating someone new. Another newcomer to Harksworth, probably. Someone young and hopeful who'd moved to the village for a fresh start. The community would welcome her warmly. include her in their activities. And in a few years, when it was time to select the next luckiest citizen, they'd have another candidate ready. The bus pulled into the depot downtown just after 2 in the afternoon. I grabbed my satchel and stepped off into the familiar smell of exhaust and hot asphalt. Cars honked in traffic. People hurried past on sidewalks, talking on phones and checking their watches. Nobody was watching me. Nobody knew where I'd been or what I'd seen. I was just another passenger getting off a bus, carrying a bag and looking tired. The Regional Herald occupied the 3rd floor of a brick building that had seen better days. I took the elevator up, listening to it wheeze and clank between floors. The newsroom buzzed with its usual controlled chaos, phones ringing, keyboards clicking, the coffee machine gurgling in the break room. My desk sat in the corner by the window, exactly as I'd left it. A stack of press releases, a coffee mug with a ring stain on the bottom, a photo of my sister's kids that I'd been meaning to update for 2 years. Frank spotted me before I'd even sat down. He came over carrying a legal pad and wearing the expression he got when deadline pressure was building. Armstrong, there you are. How'd it go up in... He consulted his notes. Harksworth, got that feel-good story for me? I set my satchel on the floor and looked at him. Frank was a good editor. Fair, professional, genuinely cared about putting out a quality paper. He'd been in the business for 25 years and had probably seen every kind of story there was to see. But he'd never seen anything like what I'd witnessed in Harksworth. Turned out to be nothing, I said. Just a harmless local tradition. They pick someone each year who's done good work for the community, give them a little ceremony. Nice people, but not really worth a story. Frank's face fell. Seriously, the way that press release was written, I thought we had something special. Small-town America, community values, that kind of thing. Yeah, I thought so too. But when you get there, it's just... I shrugged. Routine. They've been doing it for years. Same speeches, same format. The winner seemed happy enough, but there's no real angle to it. Damn. Frank tapped his pen against the legal pad. Well, what about the human interest side? The winner herself. What's her story? I thought about Jasmine standing in her living room, terror cracking through her composure as she begged me to leave town. The way she'd looked at the ceremony, serene and distant, already more ghost than woman. The sound her footsteps had made on the forest path before the darkness swallowed her completely. Just a local bank manager, I said. Nice family, been in town a few years. Nothing particularly compelling about her background. I think we'd be better off focusing on other assignments. Frank studied my face for a moment. I kept my expression neutral, professional. Just a reporter who'd chased down a lead that hadn't panned out. It happened all the time in this business. All right, he said finally. Can't win them all. Wilson's got a thing about the new shopping center development if you want to take a look at that. Sure, sounds good. Frank walked away, already moving on to the next deadline. I sat down at my desk and turned on my computer, waiting for it to boot up. The familiar routine felt strange after 3 days in Harksworth. Check email, review the assignment board, start making calls about the shopping center story. But first, I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder. I'd labeled it Story Ideas years ago, back when I still thought I might write the kind of investigative pieces that won awards and changed things. Now it mostly held press releases I'd never followed up on and interview notes from stories that never materialized. I took my notebook out of my satchel and slipped it into the folder. All those careful observations about Harksworth's 2 perfect streets and coordinated evasions. Glenn's confession about 70 years of sacrifice. Jasmine's final warning about dangerous truths. I closed the folder and put it back in the drawer, then turned the lock. The shopping center story was exactly what it sounded like. A developer wanted to build a strip mall on the edge of town. The city council was split. Local business owners were worried about competition. Environmental groups had concerns about wetland impact. I spent the rest of the afternoon making calls and setting up interviews, falling back into the familiar rhythm of small-scale local journalism. At 6 o'clock, I packed up my things and headed home to my apartment across town. I heated up leftover Chinese food and turned on the news, half listening to reports about traffic accidents and city budget debates while I thought about Kyle Ortiz making dinner for his daughter. Sadie would probably ask about her mother again. Kyle would give her the same vague reassurances, his mind clouded by whatever influence kept Harksworth's families compliant. I tried to watch television but couldn't focus. Tried to read, but the words swam on the page. Finally, I went to bed early and lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the normal sounds of city life outside my window. Sirens in the distance, cars on the street below, the hum of the air conditioning unit, no forest sounds, no whisper of wind through ancient trees, no sense of something vast and patient waiting in the darkness. Over the next few weeks, I settled back into my routine. I wrote about the shopping center controversy, covered a school board meeting, did a profile on a local restaurant owner who'd won a small business award. Normal stories about normal people living normal lives. But sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd think about Jasmine Ortiz. Wonder if she was still alive somewhere in those dark woods, or if the luckbringer had taken what it needed from her and moved on. I'd think about the next award ceremony, still 11 months away, and whoever would be chosen to walk that forest path. I never looked up anything about Harksworth online, never tried to research its history or find records of missing persons, never attempted to track down relatives of previous victims or build the kind of documented case that might convince someone to investigate. Glenn had been right about one thing. Some stories were too dangerous to tell, and some prices were too high to pay, even for the truth. The manila folder stayed locked in my desk drawer, and I went on covering shopping centers and school board meetings and small business awards, just another reporter in another newsroom carrying secrets that would never see print.